The views and opinions on Where Did the Road Go belong to those making them. Do not mistake allowing freedom of speech for agreement. This month's Where Did the Road Go is sponsored by the following amazing individuals: Greg Ross, Bill Illuminati, Allison Cook, No One, Yvonne Williams, Super Inframan, 36 Dingo, and Michael Frisky. Thank you all for helping to make this show possible. And if you'd like to help out, become a patron at wheredidtheroadgo.com. It's only $3 a month for lots of extra content.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Seriah.
Welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? And tonight I am joined by Mr. Christopher Ernst.
Hello, everybody.
And we welcome back Mr. Robert Guffey.
Hi, hello. Thank you for having me on. It's always a pleasure to discuss Jack Kirby.
Yes, indeed.
I'm sure it's going to wander away from that, but that is the focus. And Jack Kirby is someone I'm not that familiar with, but Chris is.
Yes, and we're missing Super Inframan Saxon, who is my partner in crime, and loving many things Jack Kirby and esoteric comic book related.
He's like in Iceland or something like that.
Yeah. He's traveling the world for his nefarious purposes.
Well, Super Inframan sounds like he came up with his handle based on Jack Kirby. That sounds like a very Kirby-esque handle.
It's a Japanese superhero type of thing.
Right. Yes, I see. Like Ultraman.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
That's
yes.
right. Yeah, that's right. I totally forgot about that.
But he is indeed, I think if it wasn't inspired by Japanese superheroes, it would have been inspired by Kirby. He's talked many times about his, doing some psychedelics of some sort and trying to commune with Jack Kirby.
Yeah,
Yes.
What was that?
Yes, I would like to know more about that.
You'd have to ask him. I don't remember the details.
Yeah, see, neither do I. I know it was on his ketamine treatment, and at some point he had a sit-down conversation with Kirby.
Yeah.
And that was one of the highlights of the ketamine for him.
Yeah.
That's pretty amazing. It'd be amazing if you could be guaranteed that result.
Right?
Anyone who takes it is going to talk to Jack Kirby.
Yeah.
I once had a very vivid dream where I was in the back of a limo with Jack Kirby. And I don't know if Jack Kirby was ever in a limo, but for some reason we were in a limo and we were going to, Kirby was having some sort of event or a signing, which is also something that, he did have signings at various conventions, but this was like at a bookstore or something. It was like a big event, and for some reason I was there with him. I don't know if I was interviewing him or why I was there, but I spoke to him in the back of the limo. And he actually told me things, and I wrote it down in my notebook, but this was years ago, so I would have to go back and find that notebook to find what Kirby said to me in the dreamscape. So maybe it was similar to what Kirby told Super Inframan.
Ah, interesting. Yeah, I don't know which show he talks about that on. If I could figure it out, I'll let you know.
Yes, I would like to know.
But anyway, this came about because you wrote an article on Kirby, and
I did indeed.
And where was that published?
The Jack Kirby Collector, oddly enough. And in fact, I've written about 5 or 6 articles about Jack Kirby. Each of them fairly in depth, intensive. Some of them, and I've written them for a smattering of different publications. I wrote some for the New York Review of Science Fiction, David Hartwell's magazine. I wrote some for the Fortean Times, and I wrote some for the Jack Kirby Collector, of course. And most of them deal with kind of Jack Kirby's intersection with the occult or the paranormal or high strangeness in some way. And this most recent one was in Jack Kirby Collector issue 89. And it's called G-Bomb, Masonic and Hermetic Symbolism in the Incredible Hulk. And basically it focuses on issue number 1, of the Incredible Hulk, because when the Hulk first started, which was in the early 60s, of course, it only lasted for 6 issues, and
Really?
it was canceled. And the first 5 issues were done by Kirby. The 6th one was done by Steve Ditko, who, created Doctor Strange, Spider-Man, etc. But the first 5 were all by Kirby. My original intention was to analyze the Hermetic symbolism in the first 5 issues of the Hulk, but by the time I had finished analyzing issue 1, I was already up to about 7,000 words. So I thought, if I keep going and do all for the first 5, it'll be like a book-length manuscript. And then, of course, later on, so it gets canceled after issue 6, but Kirby and Stan Lee, one assumes, was fond of the character and so put him in the Avengers, and then that kind of sparked a revival, and then they put him in Tales to Astonish. So he shared the title with, I believe, the Submariner. So the front of the book was the Hulk, and then the Submariner, and each character got half of the book. And Steve Ditko continued the character. In fact, it was Ditko who came up with the whole idea that Banner turns into the Hulk when he becomes agitated or angry or loses control of his emotions. That's actually not part of the original concept of the character. So Ditko comes up with that aspect of it. And then later on, Kirby comes back to the book. So I suppose if I were to analyze every Kirby drawn story of the Incredible Hulk with the same intensity that I focused on issue 1, it would be like a 1,000-page book or something. So I elected to stop with issue 1, which seemed to make sense.
Well, for people who don't know, give a little background on who Kirby is.
Kirby was born in 1917 and died in 94, which I distinctly remember because he died in February 94, and then the next month, in March of 94, Charles Bukowski died. So those 2 things happened 1 month and then the next month, and it was like a double header. Jack Kirby began his artistic career very young and started doing comic strips at first, and then eventually he started working for DC Comics, and he created Captain America with Joe Simon during World War II, which made a huge splash. You may have seen the iconic cover of Captain America #1 where Captain America is punching Hitler in the jaw. And then Jack Kirby was drafted and went into World War II and served under General Patton. And some of his war experiences are fascinating. One of his friends, fellow collaborators, Greg Theakston, I believe, was the one who took a camera and sat down with Kirby, and you can actually see this on YouTube. It's about maybe like a half hour long, I think, of Jack Kirby just telling war stories of his time serving under General Patton. And you can see how some of his war experiences transmogrify and influence some of the storytelling he would do later on. Not just, there are some war stories where he did like Sergeant Fury and the Howling Commandos and the Losers for DC, which are actual, just straight war stories, clearly somewhat drawing on his own experiences. But you can see it in the epic cosmic battles and that are being played out in later works like Thor and the Fourth World series, The New Gods, etc. And there's a writer-artist named Tom Scioli who did a graphic memoir of Kirby's life. That's I highly recommend. He did it fairly recently. And so, Kirby said that for some reason, when he was working at DC at that time, when he was drafted, he was working on the Boy Commandos and Sandman. He noticed that he and his fellow artists were drafted, but for some reason none of the editors were. So I don't know if they just we're going to toss the artists, into the battlefield. But eventually, Kirby manages to survive World War II, and he comes back and resumes his career at DC. But then there's a certain point where he gets into he has a problem with Jack Schiff, who was an editor at DC. where Kirby created Challengers of the Unknown, which most people see as a kind of proto version of the Fantastic Four.
Yeah.
He started doing a comic strip, Sky Masters, which somehow there was some legal dispute about royalties not being paid between Jack Kirby and DC, and it leads to Jack Kirby kind of being exiled from DC, which was the highest paying company at that time, publishers of Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, etc. And so Jack Kirby kind of finds himself out in the cold, and he has to go back to Timely, which now had turned in Timely is where he created Captain America. He has to go back there, which is now called Atlas. And according to Kirby, comes into Atlas where Stan Lee was now the editor. He comes in, and the whole operation was like on the verge of collapse. The comic book industry goes through this like every generation. There's the moment where everyone says the industry is going to collapse at any moment. In the late 50s, that's where the comic books were at that time, because they had just come out of the assault on the comic book world by the U.S. government, because somebody decided that juvenile delinquency was a direct result of reading horror comics like Tales from the Crypt,
Right.
which was a huge, EC Comics came along and did the war comics like Two-Fisted Tales and Tales from the Crypt and all of these comics that were extremely popular. And somebody decided, well, we have this juvenile delinquency problem. This must be the cause of it, obviously. And so there were actual congressional hearings about comic books. I did an article about this for Fortean Times. It's kind of a metaphor for moral panics throughout the years, and we're certainly living through several different moral panics at the moment. And something has to be chosen as the scapegoat. And so now you have parents going to PTA meetings and demanding the removal of certain books, in Florida and elsewhere, including comics. Like Mouse was pulled from high school in Louisiana, and V for Vendetta is often being pulled out of schools. Genderqueer is another graphic novel that's often attacked along these lines. And so in the 50s, it was the horror comics and the crime comics, and it almost killed the industry. And so Kirby comes into Atlas, and he says that Stan Lee is sitting there with his head in his hands, and he says people movers were moving the furniture out. I don't know how much of this is like Kirby exaggerating the situation, but basically he was saying, Kirby said, "Listen, I just let me loose, and I'll make everything okay." And so at first he's doing a series of stories, like giant monster stories that were probably clearly inspired by the success of Godzilla and The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms and similar films, and does a whole slew of these kind of short stories around different giant monsters. And then at a certain point, Fantastic Four #1 comes out in 1961, and that's like an atom bomb going off. And Fantastic Four #1 basically changes the entire direction of comic books at that point. Superheroes had not been very popular at that point because the horror comics and the crime comics had come in, and those were the most popular things. But then they pulled the plug on that. There was nothing to replace it. Then Kirby comes along, and Fantastic Four #1 comes out. Spider-Man. They bring back Captain America, which Kirby had co-created in the 40s, and all these slew of other characters, Thor, and the Avengers, and it's like a bomb going off. These stories were completely unlike the stories at DC. The stories at DC, Superman, Batman, they were very sleek, very not connected to the real world. And the Marvel stories were taking place in New York, in a recognizable city. So I can't remember who said this. Somebody said that Stan Lee took one-dimensional characters and made them into two-dimensional characters. So they were more realistic than the characters at DC. And I've read interviews with several people who later became professional comic book artists and writers, like Neal Adams, I heard Neal Adams actually say this on a panel at a San Diego Comic-Con, that Neal Adams said when he first encountered Kirby's artwork in Captain America when he was a kid, he was frightened of it. It scared him, even though these were not horror comics, but there was something about the dynamic nature of it, the kind of raw, almost 3D quality of the artwork that actually scared him. And I heard J.M. DeMatteis, who's a writer who's written a lot of comics, I heard him in an interview say the same thing. He said when he first discovered the Marvel comics, I think it was an issue of Avengers, he opened it up and he was frightened by Kirby's artwork. There was something about it that seemed ugly. And I read an interview with Grant Morrison, who's written a lot of occult-themed or Gnostic-themed comics. Grant Morrison said when he first encountered Kirby's comics, which I think would have been the DC comics from the 70s, that Kirby's artwork frightened him. And now the interesting thing is there's some controversy as to how much Stan Lee contributed to any of these books, and that's really kind of a tangled, controversial issue, but I suspect that Kirby had far more to do with these things than Stan.
Yeah.
But what's fascinating is that the comics that Kirby does at Marvel, if you look at the themes that are in those books, in Thor, in Hulk, in Fantastic Four, you can clearly see this kind of hermetic, Kabbalistic symbolism woven throughout, particularly in the 70s, when he moves away from Marvel, goes to DC, and he creates the Fourth World series, New Gods, Mr. Miracle, The Forever People, and Jimmy Olsen, which was kind of like the prologue into this trilogy of comic books. There's a definite Gnostic, Kabbalistic themes that run throughout, and these themes are not present in any of the books that Stan Lee did separate from Kirby. I mean, there are no hermetic symbolism in She-Hulk #1 or like Ravage 2099 or Stripperella. But you do see these themes in the books that he supposedly did with Stan, and then you see them even more so later on when he's working entirely on his own. So in a way, the symbolism is almost a key, a skeleton key to unlock the true origins of these characters. These themes are consistent throughout his career too. I think you can find them all the way to his last comics that he did, like Captain Victory and the Galactic Rangers and Silver Star, which are not often discussed and, in fact, are not in print at the moment, but somebody should really come along and reprint. I don't think Captain Victory has ever been reprinted in a single edition, which is unfortunate. I bought Captain Victory #1 when it came out in the early 80s, and that, too, was an important comic because it was the first independent comic that was sold through the direct market, published by an independent publisher called Pacific Comics, who had the revolutionary idea in the early 80s of saying to the comic book creators, hey, you can own your material, which was considered so alien in the comic book world that Kirby was even a little skeptical about it. Is this real? Actually offering me the full ownership of my own ideas? And by the way, Conspiracy Hounds will be interested in this fact. Ken Thomas, the late Ken Thomas, who published Steam Shovel Press, a magazine for which I wrote in the late 90s, Ken Thomas has a letter in Captain Victory #3. If you look in the back, you'll see a letter from Ken Thomas. And I wrote, at the time, I had published an article in Steam Shovel Press, and I was going back, I was looking back through my issues of Captain Victory, and I came across this letter, and I asked Ken, I go, this is the same Ken Thomas, right? Because it was the same, it was St. Louis, Missouri, Ken, 2 N's. I go, this is you, right? And he goes, oh, yeah, that was me. And it turned out he was a huge Kirby fan. So I had an interview with Jack Kirby that I'd recorded off the radio. He had appeared on Mike Hodell's Hour 25 hosted by J. Michael Straczynski, who later went on to create Babylon 5 and became a comic book writer himself. Straczynski hosted a show called Mike Hodell's Hour 25. This gets really convoluted, but Hour 25 was a science fiction show on KPFK in Los Angeles that lasted for years. It was 2 hours, 10 to midnight every Friday night, and they interviewed a whole array of amazing, science fiction writers. And Mike Hodel was the younger brother of Steve Hodel. Steve Hodel is the author of The Black Dahlia Avenger. Steve Hodel claimed that his and Mike's father was the Black Dahlia killer. Anyway, it's really strange. So anyway, Kirby was a guest on Mike Hodell's show several times, but I think maybe 91, he appeared, so it would have been like 3 years before he passed away. And I had this interview on tape, so I made a copy of it, and I sent it to Ken Thomas. And then later on, I went on YouTube, and I found this recording that was posted by the Jack Kirby Museum. And I realized when I was listening to it that it was my recording. So Ken Thomas must have sent it to the Jack Kirby Museum, because I know it's mine because it ends and begins at the same exact place in the middle of the sentence, and then when I turned over the tape is the same exact time. So if you've ever heard that interview on YouTube, you can thank me for sending it to Ken Thomas back in like 1999. Anyway, so Kirby, is in the comic book industry for decades, but he's consistently blazing new trails. I mean, first Captain America in the 40s, then in the 60s of Fantastic Four, changes the direction of comics, moves to DC, does the Forever People, Mystery Miracle, New Gods, and shows that, yes, you can do this complex kind of graphic novel before that term had been coined in the realm of mainstream comic books, really kind of pushing what a mainstream comic book could be in terms of the themes and even in terms of the artwork. He would get experimental with the artwork at times, using collages. He would create these insane collages and incorporate them in with his artwork. And then later on in the 80s, coming back with Captain Victory and creating a whole new business model or possibility of how to publish comics. And the direct market then changes the direction of how comic book creators, what comic book creators are given in terms of rights and all of that. So all the way till the end, he was consistently pushing the medium forward. Often, in a time when it seemed as if nobody really cared, beyond the limited sphere of comic book fans. Mark Evanier, who was Kirby's assistant back in the early 70s, tells the story of when Jack Kirby moved from New York to California in the early 70s. He actually met with Hollywood producers at the early days of the San Diego Comic-Con and pitched them ideas of superhero-themed movies, and none of them knew what he was talking about. He was pitching ideas of, you could do movies that, multi-level movies that all tie into each other, and and they didn't even know what the hell he was talking about. They just thought that he was crazy or ignorant, naive, So I heard someone ask Mark Evanier once, would Kirby be surprised by the success of the Marvel movies? And he said, actually, Kirby would be the one guy who wouldn't be surprised, because he was actually pitching these ideas back then. Kirby, there's not a lot of visionaries, innovators in the history of comics. I mean, there's Jack Kirby, there's Will Eisner, there's Robert Crumb, Harvey Kurtzman, who created Mad Magazine, Karl Barks, Mobius, you can name them, but there aren't a lot of visionaries who really, helped create the language of comics, but Kirby is definitely one of those. So I hope, did that answer the question?
Yes. Yes, it did. Yeah. So where does the Mason imagery come from?
Well, that's a good question. It's I should say, some of it is Masonic, but I would say, for the most part, it's Hermetic in nature. And where does that come from? There's several possibilities. One is that Kirby was simply a guy whose brain was plugged into the collective unconscious, and that a lot of this stuff is either accidental, coincidental. Someone like H.P. Lovecraft, who I think Kirby read Lovecraft. I think I can demonstrate that in some of the stories that Kirby did. But Lovecraft was a guy who was a rationalist. He didn't believe in the supernatural, and yet his stories plug into all of these symbols. Much so that later on Kenneth Grant and other people have created whole cults and religions out of Lovecraft stories, which Lovecraft would find amusing or maybe frightening. So even though Lovecraft was a rationalist, his brain was plugged into some other realm. And I think Kirby, less of a rationalist, because I think Kirby did have a kind of a belief in a magical universe. I think Kirby, on one hand, some of this stuff is him being just plugged into that kind of those Jungian archetypes in a unique way. And then on the other hand, I think partly it was the way he was raised. He was raised by Orthodox Jews in the Bronx. He tells a story in that Hour 25 interview I mentioned earlier. He tells a story about when he was 9 years old, he came down with double pneumonia. And he had a high fever, and he wakes up, and there's 10 rabbis dancing around his bed, yelling out in Yiddish, "Begone, demon! Go away, demon! Do not hurt this boy, demon!" I thought, if your parents, think that the best way to deal with double pneumonia is to have a quorum of rabbis exorcising the demon from you. And by the way, you can't, if you're a rabbi who performs exorcisms, you have to have mastered the Kabbalah. I mean, that's actually like a requirement. It's part of your training. I think that it makes perfect sense to me that his parents would have had some knowledge of the Kabbalah, and maybe passed that knowledge along to their eldest son, Jack Kirby. And so he could have had some rudimentary knowledge of the Kabbalah. And then also he talks about when he was young, he's reading the pulp magazines, amazing stories, I assume. That he said that, these pulp science fiction magazines really fired his imagination when he was a young man, so much so that his parents, he said, actually took them away at one point, like threw them away, and thought they were getting in the way of his studies or something, which is funny because later on that same thing happened to kids who were reading too many Jack Kirby comics. They had their Kirby comics taken away from them. But it's almost like with Kirby you get the Kabbalah, but filtered through pure Americana pulp fiction. So it's this weird merging of William Blake and Lovecraft and Richard Shaver and E.E. Doc Smith and Edgar Rice Burroughs, all rolled into one thing. And so particularly when you get to the Fourth World in the early 70s with the New Gods, Forever People, and Mr. Miracle, I think the correspondences with the Kabbalah is conscious. I don't think that that's just accidental. There's just too many correspondences between, for example, like Orion, who's the hero of the narrative of the New Gods, corresponds with certain aspects of the Sephiroth, a character named Metron. All these characters you could plug into different levels of the Sephiroth. There's like 10 levels of reality in the Kabbalah. There's a whole concept in New Gods called the Source, which is sort of correspondence with the idea of the Ein Sof, the kind of the realm that existed before creation. And the idea of the Source was so good that George Lucas probably took it and morphed it into the Force. There's a lot of correspondences between New Gods and Star Wars.
Definitely. The
Source and the Force, the whole idea of Orion is the son. Eventually it is revealed that Orion, our hero, is the son of our antagonist, Darkseid, right. Which of course also happens in the Star Wars trilogy. I'm sure Jack Kirby was aware of this, and you almost see when he does Captain Victory, which he would have started working on in the late 70s, it's almost like, okay, George, if you're going to rip me off, I'm going to rip you off. And then, so it's like he's taken, Captain Victory is like taking New Gods and Star Wars and then like pushing it into a whole nother arena. But, Darth Vader has very, very much has a kind of Doctor Doom look to him visually. I think there's a lot of film directors that were looking at Kirby and Marvel Comics. Now it's the general audience is aware that there are all these movies being adapted from comic books. But I think the influence of comics were always there in cinema going way back. Fellini cites Will Eisner as a huge influence. Orson Welles, Fritz Lang, Frank Capra, they all cite George Harriman's Crazy Cat as an influence. Rene, the director of Hiroshima Mon Amour, he met with Stan Lee and hired Stan Lee to write a screenplay, probably because he assumed that Stan was the one coming up with this crazy shit, and he wasn't. Mario Bava directed one of the best comic book adaptations of all time, Danger Diabolic, in 1968. Yeah. Ray Bradbury, who wrote for film, including Huston's Moby Dick. Bradbury cites Winsor McCay's Little Nemo and Slumberland had this huge impact on him in terms of his visual imagination. So the top filmmakers were always looking at comics for inspiration. And I wouldn't be, and obviously George Lucas was looking at Marvel Comics, and specifically I think he was looking at the New Gods when he came up with the idea for Star Wars. And it wouldn't surprise me if Stanley Kubrick was looking at Jack Kirby's comics, when developing 2001. I know that Kirby must have been impressed by 2001 because it was probably the closest cinematic experience that you could get to what Kirby was trying to do on paper, and later does an adaptation, a comic book adaptation of 2001 when he returns to Marvel in the 70s, and eventually even did an ongoing 2001 comic book, which unfortunately is out of print at the moment because the rights to it are all wrapped up in illegal limbo. But from that 2001 series, you get the character Machine Man, which was a favorite of mine when I was a kid. I have a distinct memory of buying Machine Man #3 from Frank's Liquor from the spin rack, because my dad would take me to Frank's Liquor and buy a horse racing for him, and I would buy some comics. So I have distinct memories of buying like Machine Man, Devil Dinosaur #1, the Captain America, when Kirby was doing Captain America in the 70s during the bicentennial, and he does this whole storyline called Mad Bomb, which is about the secret society who's trying to take back America, make America great again. And so they create this thing called Mad Bomb, which is this kind of like MK Ultra mind control device that is causing racial strife and psychic chaos across America, so they can divide people and then take America back again. A very perhaps prescient storyline on the part of Kirby. By the way, I highly recommend OMAC, which is one of the last comics he does for DC before he jumps back to Marvel. OMAC stands for One Man Army Corps, and if you're interested in reading a comic book that's all about artificial intelligence, secret societies, globalism, exploding sex robots, OMAC is the comic for you. But particularly check out OMAC #2, and on the cover you'll see a guy who looks almost exactly like Donald Trump. It's really weird. The guy builds an entire town to assassinate OMAC, and he's supposedly like he's this billionaire who has it out for OMAC. But I recommend taking a look at OMAC. Anyway.
I mean, that's part of the whole thing about Kirby is the prophecies that he, or quote unquote prophecies, his sort of semi-prophetic writings, like The Face on Mars, or I don't know if some of the designs he was doing or the stuff he was doing with Eternals was predating Chariots of the Gods, but those are two of sort of the more popular, instances of him engaging in this sort of prophetic writing. I don't know if you have any thoughts on those.
Oh yeah, well, like in OMAC, he actually used. There's a device that he calls a smart bomb,
Right.
and it's this bomb that's controlled via these people who are like sitting behind a screen and controlling it by remote control.
Yeah.
It's also interesting that OMAC he has a mohawk, which is fascinating because it's in the early '70s. It's just before punk, but yeah. That story. Well, the Eternals would have been after Chariots of the Gods. However, Kirby was always interested in that whole ancient astronaut, subgenre, because you can trace that back to not just the Face on Mars story, which certainly is fascinating. I first heard about the Face on Mars story from Richard Hoagland. I was listening to Richard Hoagland on Coast to Coast at some point in the 90s, and in the middle of the interview, Hoagland goes, the comic book artist Jack Kirby did a story called The Face on Mars back in the 50s, and I had absolutely no idea, and I didn't see the story itself until later when Titan Books in England came out with a series of hardcovers called like the Simon and Kirby Library, and it's quite a wonderful series of books, and each volume focuses on a different genre. So there's like crime, horror, and then one is science fiction. And in the science fiction volume, you'll see the story, The Face on Mars, which is quite wonderful because it's about 8 pages long, but you could easily turn it into like today it would be like a 12-issue epic. But there's enough information in those 8 pages to write a feature-length screenplay. And it's all about this astronaut, and the first panel is the Face on Mars, and they land, they go inside the Face on Mars, and they discover this like hologram, almost like virtual reality chamber, which shows to the astronaut in hologram virtual reality form the history of the dead civilization that created the face in the first place, and what happened, and how the face was created, and why it's there. The end it parallels the ending of the Brian De Palma film from the late '90s with the Mission to Mars.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah, right. Yeah, Mission to Mars.
In fact, when I read the Kirby story, I thought, did the guy or whoever wrote the screenplay for Mission to Mars, did they see this Kirby story? Because it's almost like a synopsis of Mission to Mars. And so that was done in '58, and then with the Eternals. Even though that was done after Chariots of the Gods, you could see why Kirby would be interested in Chariots of the Gods, because he was already doing stories like that in the 50s. And in fact, I wrote an article for the Jack Kirby Collector called Little Humans and Giant Gods, the extraterrestrial tiki art of Jack Kirby. And I just in-depth analyze these 6 stories that he did throughout his career, which are all focused on Easter Island. They all tie in Easter Island with UFOs, aliens, ancient astronauts, and in fact, it partly inspired. I wrote a novel called Dead Monkey Rum, which was published last year, and I even included Jack Kirby in the acknowledgments because the whole conclusion of that novel ends on Easter Island, and it was very much influenced by Kirby's imagery. But the first one he did was called, it was when he was still working at DC, and I think it was for House of Mystery, and it was called The Stone Sentinels of Giant Island. And of course it's clearly inspired by Aku Aku, the book by Thor Heyerdahl. And Heyerdahl was this ethnographer who went on the famous Kon-Tiki expedition, in this hand-built raft to prove that people from South America could have colonized Polynesia.
Yep.
And it was to demonstrate that the possibility of contacts between ancient people who were, separated by vast distances. And he follows up the success of Kon-Tiki with a book called Aku Aku, which was all about his expedition to Easter Island. And I think this book must have really fired up Kirby's imagination, because he does these 6 Tiki-themed Easter Island stories. Each one ties in with UFOs. And in the very first issue of Thor, the Norse god Thor fights these aliens from Saturn that look like the giant Easter Island heads. And I think it's clear that Kirby's brain matched up Thor Heyerdahl, and Thor, the Norse god, and stitched that together somehow with Easter Island, and suddenly you have the origin story of one of the most popular Marvel superheroes. But that's That's a surrealist technique. I mean, you're putting together two ideas that don't belong and creating something that's totally new. And it kind of, Max Ernst defines surrealism as the marriage of a sewing machine and an umbrella on an operating table.
Right.
And Kirby did that all the time. I mean, Thor is just one example. Kirby was always constantly creating these hybrids of sewing machines and umbrellas, and creating something new. But that's an early ancient astronaut story, which is in the 50s, just before he leaves DC and goes back to Marvel. And then when he goes back to Marvel, he does a story called "I Was Trapped by the Things on Easter Island," and that one is. I was talking about the Lovecraft influence. Yeah. That story is very similar to Dagon, but not in a way where it's like he ripped it off. I mean, you can just see the influence of it. There's certain parallels between Dagon and the story that was in Tales to Astonish, and it kind of mirrors the cover of Aku Aku, because the cover, you see this lone explorer and he's running in fear from this trio of Easter Island statues, and they're emerging from the earth, and they have bodies, which was something that wasn't well known. It's still not well known today that the Easter Island heads, they're not just heads, they have bodies.
Full bodies,
buried in the earth. And so the cover of Aku Aku is you see this lone explorer looking up at these towering, titanic Easter Island heads. And in this, it's the same image, except the guy's running away and the heads are emerging from the ground, with these rocky bodies. And so that story has some interesting, Lovecraft correspondences. And then he does another kind of ancient astronaut Easter Island story a couple of years later, again in Tales to Astonish, which is called Here Comes Thor the Unbelievable, Thorr. So again, we get the name Thor before Thor, the mighty Thor, and it's a story about aliens in Easter Island, but now the central alien is named Thor, Thorr, which is clearly an homage to Heyerdahl, I think. And then in a year later, he does another one called Back from the Dead, and in that one, there's the alien has this oversized head. And a tiny body, and he looks rather like a kind of Whitley Strieber gray. And then he does the Stone Men from Saturn, and that's his fifth one, and that's the one that's the first Thor story. And again, in those days, the stories were 8 pages, and yet you get all these crazy ideas, merged into one thing. But it's interesting. I was reading Sven Kirsten is a guy who specializes in the mid-century Polynesian and pop culture of in America with the Hawaiian craze and all that. And he wrote a book for Taschen called Tiki Style in 2004. And there's a section in there where he ties in Tiki and Thor Heyerdahl and Thor, the Norse god, in one paragraph. He ties it all together, but he doesn't seem to be aware of the connection to Kirby and the mighty Thor, So it's interesting that this whole idea of connecting Thor Heyerdahl with Tiki, with the Norse god, it occurred to Sven Kirsten as well, but he didn't seem to be aware of the fact that Kirby had done the same thing. But so you see these ancient astronaut stories all throughout Kirby's career, and then Eternals is kind of the culmination of it. And I was mentioning before that I see a kind of Richard Shaver influence on Kirby. You see that just in Fantastic Four #1, where the characters go underneath the earth and they find these deviant mutant creatures, these almost Deros-like creatures living under the earth. But in the Eternals, you have this battle between the Eternals, these sort of benevolent space gods who are trying to help humanity. And then there are these creatures that are called deviants, which is kind of close to, Deros or deviant robots. The deviants live underneath the ground. They're in these subterranean realms, and their whole thing is messing with humanity and trying to screw up humanity. So I see a kind of maybe a trace of Shaver in the Eternals
and wasn't it they were put there by space gods, basically?
Exactly.
They were experiments by space gods that were they were genetically altering like early hominids on Earth.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, they were like like genetically engineering them. And in the first issue, the main characters are like exploring these ancient ruins, and goes in and you see this double-page spread. And it's really similar to the image in Alien, where they come across that giant thing that's just sitting in the chair and it's dead.
Space jockey.
Yeah.
There's a scene in Eternals that's kind of similar to that, and that would have been like just a couple of years before Alien. And Dan O'Bannon, who wrote Alien, was clearly looking at comics. I mean, he had collaborated with Mobius before writing Alien.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Now, Eternals, that's the one they did the movie for a few years ago, right?
Yes.
That's right. I haven't seen it.
I tried to watch it, but I couldn't get through it.
I did. It's not beyond, I guess, one of the sort of cosmic gods having the design of one of the Kirby designs of the Celestials. It's completely just in that Marvel commercial universe.
Yeah.
I thought it was actually a pretty good movie on its own. It was directed by a really interesting, different filmmaker. I'm forgetting her name. She did what did she do? She did that Western film. She's a Chinese American filmmaker. Totally forgetting her name. It was interesting because like it felt a little different than most Marvel movies, but it certainly was not a Jack Kirby movie.
Right. I should probably take a look at it, but I just haven't gotten around to it. You would think that. I remember hearing Ray Bradbury talk once about people would come to him and say, we want to do a film adaptation of Fahrenheit 451, and originally Sam Peckinpah wanted to do Fahrenheit 451 or Something Wicked This Way Comes. Peckinpah was really eager to do, which would have been amazing to see Sam Peckinpah as Something Wicked This Way Comes.
No kidding.
But Bradbury said that they would come with him because he had final approval. And they would come with these screenplays, and Bradbury was always distressed by how they would just completely abandon the plot of the book and go off somewhere else. And Bradbury said, listen, you can just take the pages of the book and feed it into the camera. And the thing that dismays me about like what I've seen visually from the Eternals movie is like you should just be able to rip those pages out and feed them into the camera of the Eternals. It should have that kind of visual, almost psychedelic, quasi-surreal impact that the comics do. I didn't see that from the digital morass that I saw in the trailer, but sometimes you have to kind of get rid of your expectations when you see a cinematic adaptation of something. I had to, when I first saw the film adaptation of the Mothman Prophecies, I was quite dismayed, which was in 2002, because I had in my head my own view of what that movie should look like.
Sure.
and it didn't look like this. But however, since then, I've gone back and looked at the Mothman Prophecies, and when you kind of get rid of those expectations, it's actually a kind of very interesting film.
Oh, I love it.
I've grown to love it. But my first reaction was hostile.
Right.
Because it didn't meet my expectations. But those are expectations I built up inside my head.
Yeah, well, I mean, that movie seemed to be more that it presented the feel of what was going on rather than sort of the events that were actually happening.
True. Yes, absolutely. Sometimes even a theme of a book can be turned upside down, and yet it can get across the same feeling. I mean, I feel that way about like Orson Welles' The Trial. Which some people don't like Orson Welles' adaptation of The Trial because they think it diverts like thematically from the original book, but actually it gets across the feeling, the mounting paranoia of Kafka's original novel. But you can't. Film is a visual medium, and you have to change things around.
Yeah.
And sometimes that works, and sometimes it doesn't. But I mean, even like the original James Whale Frankenstein obviously deviates from Mary Shelley's novel in extreme ways to the point where it really has an entirely opposite philosophical point of view than Mary Shelley's point of view, and yet nonetheless it's this classic movie. And I'm sure it's kind of it's interesting to consider the fact there's one letter by Lovecraft where he mentions going to see Frankenstein, and I would love to get into a time machine and go back in time and go see Frankenstein with H.P. Lovecraft. And see his reaction to it, but he probably fell asleep. Even though there's other audience members who are like gasping in fear at Boris Karloff in the monster makeup. Lovecraft, in his head, he's already written Call of Cthulhu.
Yeah.
And the color out of space, nothing can match what's going on inside this guy's head. But so it's interesting how when you kind of divest yourself of these expectations, because sometimes a film can adapt the original work so precisely that it almost seems redundant.
True.
For example, when they adapted Frank Miller's Sin City, it was so obsessed with getting every nuance on the screen that you might as well just read the graphic novel.
Right. And so it's not even, not even taking into consideration, I think, one of the reasons why it failed there is because you have to look at graphic novels and film two different mediums, and that one is not necessarily the aesthetic, it's not going to necessarily translate to another. Yeah.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, I remember hearing Alan Moore say, when Terry Gilliam originally wanted to do Watchmen in the 80s, he called Alan Moore and said, do you have any advice? And Alan Moore's advice was, don't do it. Exactly, Alan Moore said, I specifically created a graphic novel that could not be adapted into a film. And I think that's true.
Yeah.
I kind of liked the Watchmen movie.
I haven't seen that either. So.
Oh, the Zack Snyder one.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, I haven't seen it.
Yeah. It's slick. It's I think yes, it's very slick. It looks like Zack Snyder. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm hitting this with Zack Snyder, but I did like that one. And it surprised me that I liked it, honestly.
Yeah.
Well, I should probably give that one a chance as well.
Right.
Although imagine what Terry Gilliam would have done.
Right.
It would have been, even if it had not been true to the original, which it probably would not have been true to the original graphic novel, it would have been interesting all on its own.
Yeah,
indeed. Yeah. I've always been interested. I don't know if you have any thoughts, Robert, on the sort of later supernatural stuff, and I mean by later it was like early 70s, but basically Etrigan, because she shifted. I don't think he wanted to write Etrigan originally, right? The demon.
Right. That's interesting because I was talking to a friend about this recently. We were talking about the fact that New Gods, Forever People, and Mr. Miracle he's in midstream. Everything. I mean, he's building this amazing operatic science fiction epic in the form of a 4-color comic book. Clearly, he's operating at all cylinders. This is his magnum opus, and suddenly the books are canceled. And to this day, no one even knows why they were canceled. I heard Neal Adams say that, basically Neal Adams implied that Carmine Infantino, who was the publisher at the time, that there was some professional jealousy or something going on there where Kirby was being, sabotaged by the people at the top. And you certainly can see evidence of that. So it's kind of a miracle that we have what we have, but it's cut short, and they tell him, so instead we get the demon and Kamandi replace what he was doing in the fourth world. And I said to a friend of mine, I said, it would be wonderful if we could go back in time and he can just continue working on the fourth world stuff. However, we would have to give up the demon and Kamandi. So are you willing to do that? And my friend was like, I don't know if I'm willing to do that. Kamandi is a perfect example of him, like an alchemist, taking base material and turning it into gold, because the publisher basically said, Planet of the Apes is really popular. Can you do something like that? And so he dusts off this concept that he'd already had for a comic strip set in the future in this apocalyptic scenario. And so the only real parallel between Kamandi and Planet of the Apes is there's one human left alive, in this case a boy, and all, not just the apes, but all the animals have evolved to human level intelligence or beyond. And he takes that concept, which was really just a directive from the publisher to go rip off that movie. He takes that and turns it into this, which is, Kamandi is, my friend said, he described Kamandi as the perfect comic book for a 13-year-old boy. And that's not an insult. It's there's just something about it where it's the perfect like action adventure science fiction comic book, and it's by no means operating at the same level of complexity as the New Gods and the Fourth World stuff. However, it's extremely readable even to this day. I mean, I read through it just a few years ago, and it's very compulsive. You kind of want to keep reading it. And the demon, which of course horror comics were popular at the time, and apparently horror was the genre that Kirby was least happy about. He wasn't particularly happy about doing a horror comic, but with the demon, you get a lot of that Hermetic stuff comes into it. That's Stephen R. Bissett, who worked with Alan Moore on Swamp Thing. Bissett said that was his favorite Kirby comic book. And of course, Bissett and Alan Moore brought the demon into Swamp Thing when they were working on that in the 80s. The demon is fascinating because it too goes into that realm that I talk about in terms of the Hulk being a kind of alchemical metaphor for the kind of the psychic schism of that the Hulk is essentially a kind of like Cold War parable for the schism of the Western mind, and so you have the doubling of the savage masculine and passive feminine, and this is all as seen through the lens of like medieval the medieval mind, but right. The idea of the schizoid man in the form of Dr. Banner, who's a physicist, so he's a modern alchemist essentially, and he like the Phoenix, which is an important symbol in Scottish Rite Freemasonry, like the Phoenix, he dies and is resurrected every time he transforms. And he's sort of like the Nagari, which is the alchemical symbol of the hermaphrodite dragon, or the Respina in Latin, which means two things, thing that is divided but united into one. And so the Banner's whole quest is to unite these two halves of himself, and then that's on the kind of the foreground story, but then in the background you got this other Cold War intrigue going on where Banner is swept up in this Cold War plot between the Soviets and the United States, and there's this character called the Gargoyle who looks a lot like Lom, or that entity that John Dee summoned right. with the big head. The Gargoyle he has this tiny body and a big head, and he's almost like a homunculus, and the Hulk is like the Golem, and so you have this Golem versus homunculus storyline going on, and so on one hand you have Banner, who is divided in his mind, and trying to unite these polar opposites, which was the goal of alchemy, to unite these binary opposites. On the global stage, you have this other storyline going on about East versus West, the United States versus the Soviet Union. The Thunderbolt Ross, who's one of the main characters of the story, is constantly calling right. Banner, what are you, a woman? Are you a milksop? Saying he's too feminine, he's too passive. Right. Yeah. And so you see this schism going on between sort of the alpha male Thunderbolt Ross, the passive, more feminine, quote unquote, Banner, and then the schism of East versus West, or capitalism versus communism, Soviet Union versus United States. So there's kind of like a personal schism, and then there's like a global schism reflected in this one story. That just is in issue number 1 of the Hulk.
Hold on right there. We got to take a quick break. We'll continue in just a moment. Quick mid-show break and a recommendation. First, contact info. Everything can be found at wheredidtheroadgo.com. If you have a story you'd like to share or come on and talk about, stories at wheredidtheroadgo.com is the email. There are links to all of our social media on the website, as well as every show, all the way back to the very first one. If you like heavy music, I also host The Last Exit for the Lost, and you can find that at thelastexit.org. There are archives and stuff that go back many, many years. As for a recommendation, I am going to go with a newer podcast. I don't know, it's been 11 episodes, so it hasn't been going very long, called Dream Sequence. It's on iHeart Podcasts, and it's sort of Nightmare on Elm Street-ish, in a sense, but with a little more complexity to it, I guess, maybe you could say. It says, I'll read the little descriptor. When down on her luck, Kay Kraft gets a call from her estranged genius sister, Sadie, inviting her to document Sadie's new invention, a machine that records dreams. Kay can't resist. What Kay doesn't know is that Sadie's come to believe there's something alive in their dreams, something that holds the key to the tragedy that tore them apart 7 years ago, something that could scare them to death. It's actually pretty good, and it's not cheesy like Nightmare on Elm Street stuff is, or campy. It's it's actually kind of an interesting idea. Like I said, there's 11 episodes so far. I don't know how far the first season's going to go, but it might be worth your time. All right, back to the show.
Want to continue spooky season after the 31st? Would you like to dive deeper into the world of the paranormal, the occult, cryptozoology, and other unexplainable topics? Then the Strange Realities Conference is the right one for you. Live and online in Nashville, Tennessee, November 1st and 2nd at SIR Nashville, and November 3rd online only. Strange Realities Conference 2024 will feature presentations by Tim Banal, Nathan Isaac, Kendall Lackey, Brent Rains, Micah Hanks, Ren Collier, Joshua Cutchin, Recluse, Nevaeh Terry, and Steve Berg as your Master of Ceremonies. Online with presentations by Seriah Azkath, Timothy Renner, Katie Andrews, Robert Guffey, Greg Bishop, and Becky Ann Galentine. Tickets are $70 in person the whole weekend or $30 online and are available at strangerealitiesconference.com. Don't miss this amazing opportunity to learn from some of the best spooktacular minds in the field of the paranormal.
All right, we're back. I'm with Robert Guffey and Christopher Ernst, and continue what you were saying, Robert.
So you brought up the demon. I was going to say that the demon kind of extends that theme years later, in the sense that the demon is also this kind of bifurcated personality. Right. In this case, the main character, Jason Blood, is actually possessed by the demon, which is a spirit that comes forth when he is needed, but he also has a kind of savage quality about him, sort of like the Hulk. So you have Kirby dealing with these themes, and you also see a lot of like cinematic influences. I think no one's really ever gone deep into the fact that Kirby was clearly a film fan, and drawing on films that maybe you wouldn't even expect. It's clear to me that you have a lot of visual homages in The Demon to the early Universal horror films like Son of Frankenstein, etc. But you also see like shades of Mario Bava. Like Black Sunday. There's this story he does for, I think it's in Jimmy Olsen, where there's this planet. It's this planet that has these like devil horns, but it's been created in this laboratory. It's like really tiny, and on the planet there are all these like supernatural beings that has been like genetically created and live there, and they fly around in these coffins. And the vampire looks a lot like the vampire in Black Sunday, the Mario Bava film. It's fascinating. Like, I don't even know when Kirby had time to go to the theater, because it seems like he was just constantly chained to his table drawing. It's also important to point out that according to his family, he would work mainly at night. He would work through the night while everyone else was asleep, which kind of that fascinates me. There's something almost symbolic about that. Everyone else is sleeping, but Kirby's hand is moving. Almost like he's asleep and working at the same time, almost like a Victorian medium doing automatic writing. James Joyce once referred to himself as an amanuensis, one who takes dictation.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that Kirby was much the same way. He was taking dictation from the source, to use Kirby's own term, and the idea of him up at night. drawing this stuff. And apparently, according to people who had watched him work, like I saw an interview, there's a documentary called Jack Kirby Storyteller, which I think you can see on YouTube. And Len Wein and Marv Wolfman are there, Len Wein and Marv Wolfman, who later became prominent comic book writers themselves. When they were teenagers, they visited Jack Kirby when he was living on Long Island before he moved to California. And they said they watched him draw the opening page of an issue of Captain America. And he just, he wouldn't have any preliminary sketches. Most artists, comic book artists included, have to do some sort of like rough layout of what they're going to do before they put pen to paper.
Sure,
Kirby wouldn't do that. Len Wein said he started drawing in the upper left-hand corner, kept drawing until he went all the way down to the lower right-hand corner, with no planning. And other artists, his peers in the comic book world were like gobsmacked by this. I heard an interview with Herb Trimpe saying that Jack Kirby came in and Stan asked for some sort of correction, or like he didn't like the cover and he wanted a new one. And Kirby just sat down and did it right in the office, whereas normally he worked at home. Sat down, drew at the office. They all gathered around and watched him just like bang out this thing with no planning. And that kind of like highlights that idea of almost like automatic writing. Like he's almost like in a trance doing this stuff. It's like Andre Breton doing automatic writing, in the 1920s with the surrealists. And and in terms of like the idea of, was all this like intentional? Was he just plugged into the Jungian unconscious? There's some, and I include some of these things in the article in the Jack Kirby Collector. There's some evidence that he was at least somewhat familiar with these kind of occult matters, and I show there's a comic book he did in the 50s called "Strange World of Your Dreams," which is a fascinating idea, because the whole concept of the comic was that you would write in and send in your dreams, and then Kirby would illustrate them. But I doubt that that's actually what was happening. He was probably just making this up, entirely on his own, And like a horror comic at the time had a host, like the witches or the Crypt Keeper in Tales from the Crypt, or the witch in Vault of Horror. They would have a host who would narrate the horror story. In this case, the host was this like Freudian dream analyst who's like sitting there like smoking a pipe and talking to the reader about, this is this dream that patient A had, and it goes into some like weird surrealist nightmare. And the cover for, I think it's issue number 2, which would have been like in the early 50s, the cover shows, it says, "The Strange World of Your Dreams," in weird, creepy lettering. And then underneath that, there's this red demon, and he's doing the sign of Pan, the sign of Nox, from the Lamech, Crowleyan rituals, from that, which is clearly based on that famous photograph of Crowley doing that sign with his hand
on his head,
doing the horns, I was just the other night, I was watching Arrow's Blu-ray release of the Dunwich Horror from 1970, and Dean Stockwell's like doing that same symbol. I wonder if that was Stockwell's idea, or if the director told him to do that. But that was in 1970, that film. This is the early 50s, so I don't know if Kirby either had a book laid out in front of him, or he was familiar with that sign. And the purpose of that sign is all about like bifurcation. It kind of like continues that theme that's in the Hulk. So he was obviously interested in these occult matters, and that's made concrete by that drawing, that cover of Strange World of Your Dreams from the 50s. But that's also interesting in the sense how you were saying how he didn't like horror comics, and he didn't want to do the demon. But it's interesting how Kirby was kind of like, he would take something that he didn't like and turn it into something that he could get enthusiastic about, which is also alchemical. So he would transmogrify these bad ideas into good ideas. So Strange World of Your Dreams, it's almost like it's his answer to the horror trend. Okay, we need a weird horror comic. He doesn't want to do horror comics, so instead he does this like weird surreal comic about like dream analysis. It's this unexpected solution to this problem. Anyway, you get back to to your original question, yes, the demon is a particular favorite of mine, and I would be loath to, if I could go back in time and give Kirby the chance to finish the Fourth World, it would be unfortunate to lose the demon as a result.
So you want to get into a little more of the stuff you talked about in the article as far as the Freemason imagery?
Well, we're sure. The Masonic symbolism comes in on the very first page because Dr. Banner creates something called the G-bomb, and most people would assume the G stands for gamma, since Banner's weapon is called the gamma bomb.
Right. Yeah,
but I think there's a hidden purpose behind the letter G. As any Mason knows, G has been the main symbol of Masonry since at least the 18th century, maybe earlier. Most scholars believe the G stands for Great Architect of the Universe or geometry. When I've been at the lodge, sometimes I've suggested that it stands for Guffey, but I think they know I'm joking. According to Albert Pike, who created the higher degrees of Scottish Rite Freemasonry as we know them today, the G stands for the generative principle, meaning the merging of polar opposites through procreation, sexual intercourse. So the title of the first story is The Coming of the Hulk, which is suggestive. And the G-bomb is drawn as like this obvious phallic symbol, and now, which could be accidental or unconscious, but Kirby did use conscious phallic symbols in other works, and there's an example of that in the Kirby collector. So in certain Hermetic traditions, sexual intercourse is symbolic of a more metaphysical aspiration, the reconciliation of opposites, which I mentioned before in terms of alchemy. So the reconciliation of opposites was one of the primary objectives of the alchemists, and the closest 20th century version of an alchemist would be a physicist, in this case, Dr. Banner. And Banner is killed by his own creation, the G-bomb, the generative principle bomb, yes, according to Pike. Then he rises from the dead as an entirely new being that combines two forms of the sexual energy, the active and the passive, the masculine and the feminine, and combines them into one being. And so like I said, the Hulk is kind of like, he's like the hermaphrodite Nagari, this dragon-like creature that was both male and female, and which was a symbol of the alchemists. And the Nagari is constantly at war with itself, dying and resurrecting, just like the Hulk is constantly at war with Banner, and vice versa. And in fact, Stan Lee explicitly compared the character to the Golem in Jewish folklore. And I think it was in the Origin of Marvel Comics. He actually explicitly says that. And the main conflict throughout Hulk is that of this, the Golem versus the non-Golem, or the savage irrationality of the inhuman versus the empathy and passivity of the human being, of Banner. I quote at one point Erich Fromm, the psychologist. He wrote one time that a man has followed rationalism to the point where rationalism has transformed itself into utter irrationality, and that applies to mid-century America and Banner / Hulk, in the sense that both minds are linked by their own weaknesses and drawbacks, and they're tied together by their inability to accept each other as necessary halves of the same being. And they're forced to work together over and over again just to survive. So in the first issue, there's this schizophrenic struggle, which is presented as a kind of microcosm for the bigger problem, which is the schism between East and West, which has just grown worse since World War II. And it's a divide that's encouraged by those who make money off waging war, and that mindset is symbolized by the alpha male General Thunderbolt Ross, which has its own Kabbalistic significance, the word thunderbolt, and he's constantly disgusted by Banner's feminine qualities as he sees it, what Ross perceives to be Banner's like passive qualities. He's constantly riding him for being a peacenik, and there's that interesting paradox. Apparently Banner is a peaceful scientist, and yet he's created this weapon of war, which has been appropriated from him and turned to means that he wasn't even intending in the first place. And certainly, that doesn't just happen to comic book scientists. I've known, if you've read Chameleon, you'll know that I was friends with a scientist who had his own creation taken away from him and used for destructive means. So Banner and the Hulk kind of have to figure out how to reconcile their own polar opposite natures. And then you have the United States and the Soviet Union having to figure out how to coexist without blowing each other up, which, of course, is a situation that we still face in 2024, maybe more so than in 1963 when the character, or 62, when the character first appeared. And by the way, it's interesting that Kirby's work kind of inspires a whole generation of other artists and writers in unexpected ways. And of course, there are other artists. Kirby would talk about how he'd be at a comic book convention, and a kid would come up to him, and he would say, "Oh, I want to be just like you, Jack. I want to grow up, and I want to draw the Hulk, or I want to draw Captain America." And according to Mark Evanier, Kirby was always very polite to people, even if he maybe shouldn't have been. And the kid walked away, and he turned to Evanier and he said, "The kid doesn't get it. If he wanted to be like me, he wouldn't draw my creations. He would create something of his own." So there's like a lot of people who they're inspired to a certain extent, but they kind of, they just aspire to become part of the machine, and do carbon copies of what's been done before. And but there's a graphic novel that came out recently by the great Barry Windsor-Smith called Monsters, which I highly recommend. He worked on it for decades, and it's clearly inspired by the Hulk, but it's like if you took Hulk #1 and took it into the most up places you could imagine. And it gets into Nazism, it gets into government conspiracies, and Barry Windsor-Smith started the book as a Hulk graphic novel in the 80s. And then, and the whole idea was this idea that Bruce Banner wasn't turned into the Hulk as a result of this gamma bomb, but that there were psychological problems going back when he was a kid, that he was essentially traumatized by his and physically abused by his father. And Barry Windsor-Smith was going to create this whole graphic novel around this idea. And apparently, Bill Mantlo, who was a writer at Marvel, saw these pages in the Hulk editor's desk, and then essentially just took that story and did an issue of the Hulk, just a normal issue of the Hulk, where he incorporated some of these ideas into it. And some of those ideas find their way into the Ang Lee Hulk movie. And this pissed off Barry Windsor-Smith. He was like, this. And so he took what he'd already done, and he went away. And then he starts thinking, well, maybe this doesn't need to be a Hulk story. And so he starts transmogrifying it, turning it into gold, by taking what he had been doing and turning it into something far more dark, far more complex than he had originally intended to do. And he continued to work on it for about, I think, over 30 years. And it was eventually published a couple of years ago. Every year I do a top 10 graphic novel list on my blog, cryptoschatology.com, and Monsters was at the top of the list for that year. I highly recommend it, but in a weird way, if you read issue 1 of the Hulk, kind of like if you read my article and then read issue 1 of the Hulk, and then see the kind of symbolism that's lurking underneath, it's like Barry Windsor-Smith takes that unconsciously and takes it to whole nother level. So I highly recommend the Barry Windsor-Smith graphic novel. It's worth your time, and it's a good idea to read it in one sitting. But it's almost like psychically, you kind of have to put it aside for a few minutes to come back because it's so intense. Yeah.
Oh, I was going to say we're almost out of time. We continue this a little on a Patreon. But I want you to tell people, again, where they can find your blog, what books you have out, and your new book you have out.
Oh, yes. So my latest book is the Expectant Mother Disinformation Handbook, And Madness Heart Press is publishing it. It's coming out October 27th, just a few days before Halloween. It's the longest book I've ever written, and it's both nonfiction and fiction. It's a novel. It's a collection of short stories. It's all of these things. And conspiracy hounds and aficionados of high strangeness and cinema fans and comic book fans will all be interested in this book. In a way, thematically, it emerges out of Operation Mind, my previous nonfiction book. It's all about disinformation, but from a satirical viewpoint. It is darkly humorous. I think you will be amused and alarmed. And then after that, I have a book coming out called Hollywood Haunts the World, an investigation into the cinema of occulted taboos, published by Head Press in England. And it's probably coming out early next year. And then in the upcoming issue of New Dawn magazine, I have an article coming out called Freemasons from Outer Space, Masonic Symbolism and Extraterrestrial Encounters, which will be in the next special issue of New Dawn. And I'm doing a presentation for Conspiranormal's Strange Realities Conference on November 3rd, which will be online. And I'll be doing a talk about the cinema of high strangeness, particularly focusing on the films of Edgar G. Ulmer, one of my favorite directors, and that'll kind of tie in with the forthcoming book, Hollywood Haunts the World.
Oh, okay. You're busy.
Nice. You're speaking too at that, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
Yes, so I'll be speaking November 3rd. It'll be 2 days before the election.
It's what, second or third or third and fourth?
I think it's...
what day are you speaking?
The third is the last day, which I think is a Sunday.
Yeah,
that's
so
the online portion.
Okay, yeah. So I'm obviously on the online one as well.
Yeah.
I have no idea what I'll be talking about. I don't plan that far ahead.
Better not to know.
I'll figure it out the night before. But anyway, let's continue talking a little bit into Patreon. What's your website again, Robert?
Cryptoschatology.com.
All right, and all your books are available like on Amazon and stuff?
On Amazon, and you can pre-order the Expectant Mother Disinformation Handbook either from Amazon, or if you don't want to deal with the evil multinational corporation, you can get it from the MadnessHeartPress.com website.
All right, awesome. Thank you very much. All right, I'd like to take a moment here to thank all of my Patreons for their support. Without you, this show would not be possible. And I want to give a shout out to those of you pledging $10 or more. Greg Ross, John Blackburn, Madeline J., Matt in Delaware, Allison Cook, Super Inframan, 36 Dingo, Tim, Andrew Nichols, Matthew Sproul, Martha, Midnight Review Presents, Christine, a blue second-gen MR2 drifting around a Japanese mountain, Patricia Giaquinta, American Rambler, Andrew Maines, Ann Witowski, Barbara Fisher, Beverly Williamson, Illuminati, Bright Rectangle, Charles Davis, Charles in Florida, Land of the Crazy and Communicable, Corey Nelson, Craig Parmenter, Diane B., MTK, Eric Citron, Eric Todd, History and Coffee, J. Otto Bullitt, Jack Huntington, James Lindsay, Jim and Sophie, John Mattingly, John Bracken, Carla Mahoney, Kevin Schreck, Cool Kitty, Kristen L., Laser Printer Jam, Lauren McLean, Linda, Linz Jackson K., MJ Armstrong, Mark Brady, Sasha McHale, Schmooples, Devourer of Mortal Souls, Marty Garza, Mark Shoemaker, Jonathan Frost, Ole Andre Olar, Paul Jeffries, Perry Peters, Philosopher of Mirrors, Riker and Stark, Ron Dupre, Sam Sharon, Sarah Horgan, Stacy Sherwood, Stevie Norman, Strange Stories with the Seeker and Skeptic podcast, Tactical Therapist, Taylor Bell, Thunderboy, Tyler Glimstead, Varosh K., Victoria, Vincent Trewell, Will Gebhard, Will Powell, Ren Collier, Annabelle Smith, Caroline Walker, TDT Skunkworks, Matthew Brown, Colin Karras, and Craig Sagastumi. Thank you all so very much for the support. There is a Patreon-only segment with this, as there generally is. So if you liked what you heard, there's that. And you don't have to become a patron. You can just go to the Patreon site, which is at wheretheroadgo.com. You see the big Patreon link. You click on it. And you can buy a single extra episode if you want to do that. You can also check out the documentary Chris made, Magicians Long to See. And it's $20 to watch it off the Patreon site. Or you can become a patron for $3 and get extra content every week. I wanted to thank a couple of people here. I wanted to thank Linz Jackson K and Christian Gao for sending in some donations for my birthday. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. As well as to everyone else who did. And I want to thank Schmooples, Devourer of Mortal Souls, for upping their membership to sponsor level. Welcome back, Schmooples. I'll see you next time. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.
I got this really strange email last night.
I need to see what's going on with this mystery file.
Hey, it's a map of a town called Ocean Bay.
Someone sent these images to you for a reason.
I'm so lost right now.
When was the last time you chose a direction and followed it?
I'm going to Ocean Bay.
We don't get many tourists this time of year.
Ocean Bay is a friendly town, but we're not that friendly.
I never sent you an email. I don't even know you.
And why exactly are you here?
The map is the reason we're here.
Maps help when you're lost.
Do you know what a trap street is?
Trap streets aren't real. They don't exist.
Don't trust anyone unless they give you a reason to trust them.
I think he's dead.
How could so much damage happen to a human body in such a short period of time?
What the hell is going on here?
From the creators of Strange Air, this is Trap Street.
So maps can have secrets.
Yes. Maps can have secrets.